Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. It was back in 82, maybe 83. Lord, time flies like gnats on a summer evening. I was still a young feller then, full of vinegar and the need to prove myself. My daddy, bless his soul, had taught me everything he knew about fishing the Gulf, but I was restless, always looking for something bigger, something legendary. The whispers started in the docks down in Biloxi. Fishermen talk, you know, always exaggerating, always trying to outdo each other. But this was different. This wasn't just tavern talk. This was hushed tones and nervous eyes. Talk of a monster grouper. They called him Old Leviathan. Now I'd caught my share of big grouper over the years. 100-pounders, maybe even a touch more. But this was different. They said Old Leviathan was different. They said he lived out past the continental shelf, in a spot where the water was dark as ink, and the pressure could crush a submarine. They said he was bigger than a Volkswagen, with eyes like dinner plates, and a mouth that could swallow a man whole. Most folks dismissed it as fisherman's lore, a tall tale spun to scare the tourists. But something about the way they talked about him, the fear in their voices, it stuck with me. It got under my skin like chiggers in July. I couldn't shake it, so I started doing my research. I pored over charts, studied the currents, talked to divers who'd gone out that far. Most just laughed in my face, told me I was chasing a ghost. But a few, the ones I trusted, they admitted they'd heard the rumors too. They'd seen things out there, strange readings on their sonar, unexplained shadows in the deep. I had a boat back then, a 28-foot Bertram, named her the Wanderer. She was a sturdy girl, built for the open water. I spent weeks getting her ready, reinforced the hull, upgraded the sonar, rigged up a heavy-duty winch that could haul a small car out of the ocean, and I started preparing my tackle. Now, you gotta understand, regular grouper fishing gear ain't gonna cut it with something like Old Leviathan. I'm talking about thick braided line, strong enough to tow a truck, hooks forged from hardened steel, and a rod that felt like holding a telephone pole. I even had a custom-made lure built, a giant articulated sardine, painted with luminescent paint to attract attention in the deep. My wife, bless her heart, thought I was losing my mind. She'd say, "Jerry, you're going to get yourself killed chasing that fish. Leave it alone. It's just a story." But I couldn't. The idea of Old Leviathan had burrowed its way into my soul. I had to know if he was real. Finally, the day came. The weather was perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, and a gentle breeze blowing off the Gulf. I packed the Wanderer with enough fuel, food, and water to last a week. I kissed my wife goodbye, told her I loved her, and pointed the Wanderer's bow towards the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun beat down, the engine hummed, and the water stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of blue. As I got further from shore, the other boats disappeared. It was just me, the Wanderer, and the open ocean. Then I hit the spot. The coordinates I'd painstakingly calculated from the charts and the divers' reports. The bottom dropped off sharply, plunging into what felt like another world. The water turned a deep, forbidding blue, almost black. The sonar screen lit up with jagged peaks and valleys, indicating a complex underwater landscape. I cut the engine and let the Wanderer drift. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the creak of the hull and the distant cries of gulls. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer, and lowered my line. The weight of the lure and the sinker pulled the line taut. It felt like I was lowering a small anchor. I watched the line spool out, counting the meters as they ticked off on the counter. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. The water was getting colder, darker. Finally, at 300 meters, the line stopped. I was on the bottom. I engaged the reel and started jigging the lure, trying to attract some attention. I waited. Nothing. Just the feel of the current tugging at the line. I waited another hour. Still nothing. Doubt started to creep into my mind. Maybe my wife was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. Maybe old Leviathan was just a myth, but I couldn't give up. Not yet. I adjusted my position slightly and tried again. This time I let the lure sit on the bottom for a longer period, hoping to pique the interest of anything that might be lurking nearby. Then it happened. The rod bent double. It was like hitting a brick wall. The line screamed off the reel. I grabbed the rod with both hands, braced my feet against the deck, and held on for dear life. Whatever was on the other end was powerful, incredibly powerful. It was pulling the Wanderer sideways, like she was nothing more than a toy boat. I tightened the drag on the reel, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The line kept screaming out. My arms were aching, my back was burning, and my knuckles were white. I knew that if this thing kept running at this pace, I was going to get spooled, and once that line snapped, whatever was down there would be gone forever. I had to do something. Slowly, carefully, I started to gain some ground. Inch by inch, I cranked the reel, fighting against the immense weight and power on the other end. My muscles screamed in protest, but I refused to give in. For what felt like an eternity, it was a battle of wills. Me against this thing. The sun started to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The air grew cooler, and the sea became even darker. Finally, after what felt like hours, I started to see some progress. The runs became shorter, the pulls less violent. I was gaining line. I knew I was getting close. Then I saw it. On the sonar screen, a massive shape appeared. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. It dwarfed the Wanderer. It was old Leviathan. My heart pounded in my chest. I was terrified, but I was also exhilarated. I had found him. The legend was real. Slowly, painstakingly, I brought him closer to the surface. The strain on the line was incredible. I could feel the heat of the reel burning against my fingers. Then he broke the surface. The sight of him took my breath away. He was enormous. His body was a mottled brown and gray, covered in barnacles and scars. His eyes were huge, like ancient knowing orbs. His mouth was a cavernous maw, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. He looked at me, or at least I thought he did. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I felt a connection, a sense of awe and respect. This was an ancient creature, a survivor. He had seen things I couldn't even imagine. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, me and old Leviathan. Then he did something unexpected. He just stopped fighting. He hung there, suspended in the water, his massive body barely moving. I loosened the drag on the reel and let him rest. I knew that I could probably reel him in, get him close enough to the boat to take a picture, maybe even try to tag him. But something told me not to. I looked at him, at his ancient eyes, at his scarred body. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to conquer him. I just needed to know that he was real. So I did the only thing that felt right. I cut the line. The lure, the hook, the leader, all drifted away, sinking back into the depths. Old Leviathan turned slowly and disappeared back into the darkness. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty ocean. The sun had set completely, and the stars had started to come out. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the Wanderer. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found what I was looking for, not in the fish itself, but in the journey, in the challenge, in the knowledge that there are still mysteries out there, hidden in the depths of the ocean. I started the engine and turned the Wanderer towards home. The journey back was long and uneventful, but I wasn't the same man who had left. I had seen old Leviathan, and I had learned something about myself in the process. I never told anyone the full story. Most folks wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have said I was crazy or lying or just plain old making it up. But that's all right. The memory is enough. It's a story that only I know the full truth of. The Wanderer's hull had some damage over the years and ended up being sold for scraps, but it all paid off. That fishing adventure gave me a lifetime worth of stories to tell. All right now, y'all settle in, 'cause I got another tale for you. This one's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, just waiting for the right time to be told. The wind carried the scent of salt and adventure as I stood on the dock, staring out at the sea that had been my companion for over 45 years. The morning was young, the sky a soft shade of dawn pink, and the water stretched endless before me. Eleanor, my trusty boat, bobbed gently with the tide, ready as always for another journey. Something deep in my bones told me this trip would be different, though. A gut feeling, the kind a fisherman learns to trust after a lifetime on the water. Debbie stood at the cabin door, arms crossed, a knowing look in her eyes. "You be careful out there, Jerry," she said, her voice carrying that mix of love and mild exasperation. She knew as well as I did that I wouldn't turn back, no matter what the ocean had in store. I kissed her on the forehead, grabbed my gear, and stepped onto Eleanor's deck. The engine rumbled to life beneath me, the sound a comforting promise that she was as ready as I was. The sea was calm at first, an easy ride as I made my way toward deeper waters. The sun climbed higher, warming my back, and the familiar solitude settled in. It was just me and the open water, the only company the occasional gull circling above. I cast my first line, waiting, watching, knowing that patience was the true art of fishing. It started as a subtle tug, a teasing motion that sent a thrill through my fingers. Then suddenly the line pulled hard, nearly yanking the rod from my grip. I planted my feet and reeled in, my muscles straining against the force. Whatever was on the other end was strong, determined, a fighter. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The fish wasn't giving up, and neither was I. The boat rocked as waves crashed against the hull, the fight between man and fish playing out in the heart of the deep. With each pull, I felt the power of the sea, the thrill of the chase, the unspoken respect between predator and prey. At last, the silver body of the fish broke the surface, glistening in the sunlight. A massive tuna, the biggest I had seen in years. I hauled it onto the deck, breathless, victorious. My hands shook with exhaustion, but my heart pounded with satisfaction. This was why I came out here, why I answered the call of the water time and time again. The sky darkened too quickly, the air thick with the scent of an approaching storm. I had seen enough storms to know this one wasn't going to be gentle. The waves grew restless, slamming against Eleanor's sides. I needed to head back before it was too late. Lightning split the sky, followed by the deafening roar of thunder. Rain pelted down in sheets, blinding me as I fought to steer Eleanor through the chaos. The boat lurched, nearly tipping as the waves swelled around me. My grip on the wheel tightened, knuckles white as I battled the sea's fury. For hours I wrestled against the storm, every inch of my body screaming with effort. The world was reduced to darkness and crashing water. I had been through rough seas before, but this was something else. The ocean had turned against me, and I was at her mercy. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm's rage softened. A strange stillness settled over the water, an eerie calm. I took a deep breath, shaking, soaked to the bone. But the battle wasn't over yet. The storm had passed, but I was left adrift. The sea stretched endlessly around me, and I had lost my bearings. My radio was silent, my compass spinning wildly. I needed to find my way home. The ocean, calm as it seemed, held unseen dangers. Strange shadows moved beneath the surface, and I knew that I was not alone. The deep had its own rules, and I was just another traveler passing through. Supplies were running low. The fresh water I had brought was nearly gone, and my stomach growled with an ache I tried to ignore. I cast my line again, hoping for another catch, something to keep me going. Night fell, bringing with it an unfamiliar loneliness. The stars above were my only company, their silent glow a reminder of how small I was in the vastness of the world. I whispered a prayer to Debbie, hoping she wasn't too worried. Morning brought a sliver of hope. A seabird landed on my deck, a sign that land wasn't far. My heart surged with renewed determination. I adjusted my course, following the bird's path. As the sun rose higher, a shape emerged from the mist. An old wreck, half sunk, drifting aimlessly. I approached cautiously, wondering what stories it held, what sailors had once called it home. Far on the horizon, a light flickered. A ship, a lighthouse. I couldn't be sure, but I set my course toward it, my spirit lifting with each passing moment. The waves grew rough again, testing my resolve. I gritted my teeth and pushed forward, the promise of safety driving me through the hardships. Land. At last I saw it, a thin line on the horizon, growing larger with each minute. My heart pounded. I was almost home. As I pulled into the dock, Debbie was there, waiting. She ran to me, her eyes filled with relief. "Took your time, didn't you?" she said, smiling through her worry. I laughed, pulling her close. The sea had tested me, but I had made it back. And as long as I had strength left in my body, I knew I would return to its call again. Y'all hang tight. I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind, like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back, and when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. The bayou. Now that's a place where the water runs deep, and the stories run even deeper. I remember this one particular time, a trip that started out like any other, but turned into something I'll never forget. The kind of memory that sticks with a man, shaping the way he sees the water and the things that live in it. It was early fall, the air thick and humming with the sound of cicadas, the kind of morning where the mist lingers on the water like a ghost reluctant to leave. I had set out before first light, my boat cutting through the stillness of the bayou, the only sound the steady chug of the motor and the occasional splash of something unseen slipping into the water. I had fished these waters for years, knew the turns of the channels like the lines on my own hands, but no matter how many times I came out here, the bayou always held a kind of mystery that kept a man on his toes. I had a feeling about that day, the kind of quiet sense that the water was ready to give something up if I was patient enough to take it. I found my spot, a little opening where the cypress trees leaned in close, their knotted roots stretching into the murky depths. Spanish moss draped down like nature's own curtains, shading the water from the climbing sun. I cut the engine, letting the boat drift, the silence wrapping around me like an old coat. I started out slow, casting my line, watching the bait disappear into the dark water. The bayou wasn't like the open sea. Out here everything was slower, quieter, but no less dangerous. You learned to respect the things beneath the surface, things that had been here long before you and would be here long after. Gators watched from the banks, their eyes barely breaking the surface, patient as time itself. Snakes coiled in the trees, waiting for an unsuspecting meal to pass beneath them. And then there were the fish, big, strong, and mean, the kind that didn't come easy. That morning, it didn't take long before I felt the first tug. A sharp jerk, then a second, stronger than the first. I knew right away this was no ordinary fish. The pull had weight, the kind that spoke of something old and stubborn. I set the hook, bracing myself as the fight began. The line cut through the water, sending ripples out in every direction. My reel whined as the fish took off, dragging me into a battle that I hadn't quite been prepared for. Minutes passed, maybe more, the world shrinking down to just me, the rod, and whatever was on the other end of that line. I fought with everything I had, muscles straining, sweat beading on my forehead despite the coolness of the morning. The fish wasn't giving up, but neither was I. I could feel the strength in its movements, the determination. I respected it, even as I pulled against it, knowing that out here, every fight was a test. And then, just when I thought I had the upper hand, the fish changed tactics. It dove hard, pulling the line straight down, the kind of move that made my stomach drop. I held on, digging my feet into the bottom of the boat, my arms burning with the effort. I wasn't sure how much longer I could last, but I wasn't about to let this one get away. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw it. A massive shadow rising from the depths, breaking through the murky water with a force that took my breath away. A gar, and not just any gar. This was the biggest I had ever seen. Its body was long and armored, prehistoric in its design, its sharp teeth glistening in the weak morning light. It thrashed, trying one last time to break free, but I was ready. With one final pull, I brought it alongside the boat, staring into the wild, unblinking eyes of a creature that had probably been alive longer than I had. I took a moment to catch my breath, feeling the weight of the catch in my hands, the way its body pulsed with life and defiance. This wasn't just another fish. It was a reminder of why I did this, why I came out here time and time again, chasing something just beyond my reach. I let out a slow breath, knowing that this was a story I'd carry with me for the rest of my days. As I made my way back, the bayou stretched out ahead of me, just as mysterious and untamed as ever. The mist had lifted, the sun rising higher, casting long shadows across the water. I had won my fight that day, but I knew the bayou would always have more waiting for me. And as long as I had breath in my lungs and strength in my arms, I'd keep coming back, answering the call of the water. I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. Hurricanes, they're a fact of life down here on the Gulf Coast. You learn to respect them, you learn to watch the signs, and you learn to get the heck out of Dodge when they come calling. Most of the time, you get a good few days warning, plenty of time to haul your boat up on blocks, batten down the hatches, and hunker down with some iced tea and wait it out. But this one wasn't like that. This one blew in like a runaway train, sneaky like a thief in the night, and nearly stole my life. It did. It was back. It must have been 98, maybe 99. Can't rightly remember the year, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. Summer was in full swing, hotter than blue blazes, the kind of heat that hangs heavy in the air, makes the cicadas sing louder and slower, and just saps the energy right out of you. But the fishing was good. Oh, Lordy, was it good. Red snapper were biting like crazy, and I was bringing in my limit every trip. Enough to keep the freezer full, sell a bit to old Mrs. Henderson down at the fish market, and still have some left over to share with my neighbors. A good summer, a real good summer. That morning started just like any other. Woke up before the sun. That's the fisherman's way, you know. Got to beat the heat and beat the crowds. Made myself a strong cup of coffee, black as sin and hot as the hinges of hell, and a couple of slices of toast with some homemade fig, preserves my wife, bless her soul, used to make. She's been gone, well, a good long while now, but her preserves, they still sweeten my mornings. Hopped in my old Ford pickup, that trusty beast, and drove down to the marina. The Salty Dog, that's what I called my boat. A 22-foot Grady White she was. Not fancy, not new, but solid as a rock and seaworthy as they come. She'd seen me through a lot, that boat. We were partners, me and the Salty Dog. Always looked after each other. Got down to the dock. The air was still cool then, just starting to get that humid edge to it. The sky was clear as a bell, not a cloud in sight. Sun just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Sea was flat calm, like a sheet of glass reflecting the dawn. Perfect fishing weather. Couldn't have asked for better. I untied her lines, fired up the engine, that old reliable purr, and idled out of the no-wake zone. Headed out towards my favorite snapper spot, about 30 miles offshore. Out there you get away from the crowds, and the fish are always bigger, tastier too, I swear. The trip out was smooth as butter, just the gentle rocking of the boat, the smell of salt air, and the sound of the engine humming, seagulls crying overhead, dolphins playing in the wake. Days like that, you feel like you're living in a postcard, like nothing could ever go wrong. Got to my spot, dropped anchor, and got to work. Baited my hooks with some squid, dropped my lines, and bam, almost instant bite. Pulled up a nice chunky red snapper, bright red and feisty as could be. Grinned like a fool. This was going to be a good day, I thought. And it was for a while. Fish were jumping in the boat. The sun was climbing higher, warming my back, and I was whistling along to some old country tune on the radio. Felt like I was on top of the world. Had about half my limit in the cooler already, and it wasn't even 10 in the morning. Then things started to change. Subtle at first, like a whisper in the wind before the storm. I noticed the wind picking up a little. Just a slight breeze, hardly anything to worry about. But it felt different, colder somehow, and it shifted direction. Started coming from the north, which was unusual for that time of year. Normally the summer winds blow in off the Gulf, warm and moist. Looked up at the sky, still blue overhead, but towards the north, over the land. There was a haze starting to gather, kind of a grayish, yellowish haze. Didn't look like rain clouds, not yet. More like something brewing. Ignored it for a bit. Figured it was just some afternoon thunderstorms rolling in early. Happens sometimes. But the wind kept picking up, and the haze was getting thicker, darker. The sea, which had been so calm, started to get a little chop to it. Just little whitecaps, but still. The radio started acting funny. Static creeping in, drowning out the music. Tried switching channels, see if I could get a weather report. Nothing but static and garbled voices. That's when a little prickle of unease started to creep up my spine. Then the birds went quiet. Seagulls stopped crying, just disappeared. Dolphins vanished too. The whole ocean seemed to hold its breath. And the wind. Lord, that wind was starting to howl now. No longer a breeze. This was a proper wind, pushing the boat around, making it harder to hold my position. Looked up at the sky again. The haze had swallowed up the blue. The whole sky was this sickly gray-yellow color now, and it was moving fast, rushing in from the north like a freight train. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a thunderstorm. This was something else, something bad. Hurricane, I said out loud to myself, the word catching in my throat. Couldn't believe it. Hurricanes don't just pop up like this, not without warning. We always get days to prepare. But looking at that sky, feeling that wind, I knew, in my gut, this was a hurricane, and it was coming right for me. Panic started to set in, but I pushed it down. Years of fishing, years of dealing with rough seas, kicked in. Had to stay calm, had to think. First thing, haul anchor. Couldn't stay anchored in this. Boat would get swamped for sure. Started cranking that anchor winch. Wind was screaming now. Rain starting to spit, stinging my face. Waves were getting bigger, choppier, tossing the boat around like a cork. Took forever to get that anchor up, felt like. Every muscle in my arms screaming. Finally got it aboard, stowed it as best I could, and scrambled back to the helm. Engine roaring now. Pointed the boat into the wind, trying to keep her steady. Needed to head back to shore, and fast. But shore felt 1,000,000 miles away. The storm hit then, not gradually, not with a slow build-up, just bam, like a giant fist slamming down on the ocean. Wall of rain hit first, blinding, torrential. Couldn't see a thing. Then the wind, a solid wall of air, like hitting a brick wall at full speed, knocked the breath right out of me. Waves exploded around the boat, huge monstrous things, rising up like mountains, then crashing down with a roar. The salty dog was tossed around like a toy, up one wave, down another, sideways, every which way, but loose, lost all sense of direction, just hanging on for dear life, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, fighting to keep the boat pointed into the waves, engine screaming, straining, but barely making headway against the wind and waves. Rain was coming down so hard it was like being underwater, even above deck. Couldn't see, couldn't hear, just the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and the shuddering of the boat. Thought for sure she was going to break apart. Right then and there. Waves kept getting bigger, meaner. One minute I was staring up at a wall of water 20 feet high. The next I was plunging down into a trough so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Water was pouring over the sides, filling the cockpit. Bilge pump was working overtime, but it was a losing battle. Tried to call for help on the radio again, but it was useless. Just static and crackling. Lost contact with everyone. Alone out there in the middle of the storm. Just me and the salty dog against the full fury of nature. Time lost all meaning. Could have been hours, could have been minutes. Felt like an eternity. Just fighting, struggling, trying to survive. Every wave felt like it was going to be the one to flip the boat, to send me to the bottom. Fear was a constant companion, gnawing at my insides, whispering that this was the end. Remember looking out through the driving rain and seeing something big and dark looming through the waves. Thought it was another monstrous wave, but then it got closer, and I realized it was a ship, a big cargo ship, wallowing in the storm, just as helpless as I was, but a whole lot bigger. Scared me even more seeing that thing. Made me realize just how small I was, how insignificant, out here in the face of this storm, like an ant facing a bulldozer. Kept fighting, kept trying to steer, kept pumping the bilge, kept praying, prayed to God, prayed to my wife, prayed to anyone who might be listening, just begging for it to stop, begging for a break. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it started to ease. Wind didn't howl quite so loud. Rain didn't fall quite so hard. Waves, still big, still rough, but not quite so monstrous. Like the storm was taking a breath. Held my breath too, not daring to believe it. But it kept easing. Wind died down a bit more. Rain turned to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. Clouds started to break up, and through the gaps I saw blue sky. Just patches of it, but blue sky nonetheless. Sun even peeked through for a moment, weak and watery. But still, the sun. Felt like I hadn't seen the sun in days. Or maybe it had only been hours. Didn't matter. The storm was passing. The sea was still a mess. Waves still big and confused. But the worst was over. Engine was still running, thank God. Boat was battered, bruised, cockpit full of water, but she was afloat. We'd made it. We'd survived. Sat there for a long time after the storm passed, just catching my breath, letting the adrenaline drain away, shaking like a leaf, cold and wet and exhausted, but alive. That was all that mattered. Alive. Slowly, cautiously, I turned the salty dog toward shore. Trip back was slow, careful. Waves were still kicking up, and the boat was riding low with all the water in it. But the sun was coming out stronger now, warming my face, drying my clothes. Saw other boats out there, coming out of hiding, blinking in the sunlight like newborn calves. Everyone looking around, taking stock of the damage, the aftermath. We'd all been through it. We'd all survived. Finally limped back into port. Folks were there on the docks, waiting, worried, sick. Saw my buddy, old Billy, waving his arms, yelling my name. He ran down as I tied up, face all pale and drawn. "Jerry, you all right? We thought you were a goner." I just grinned, weak and shaky, and said, "Like a bad penny, Billy. Always turn up again." He slapped me on the back hard enough to make me cough, but it felt good. Felt good to be back on solid ground, felt good to be alive, felt good to be among friends. Later we found out what happened. That storm, they called it a freak storm, formed out of nowhere, strengthened over warm water in record time, and slammed into the coast with hardly any warning. Caught everyone by surprise. Some folks weren't so lucky. Lost boats, lost homes. Some even lost their lives. But me and the salty dog, we made it. Learned a lesson that day, let me tell you. Respect the sea. Always respect the sea. You think you know it. You think you've seen it all. And then something like that comes along and reminds you just how small you really are. Still go fishing, you know. Can't keep an old fisherman away from the water. But I'm a whole lot more careful now. I watch the skies. I listen to the weather reports. And if there's even a whisper of trouble, I head for shore. Ain't no fish worth going through that again. Not for all the tea in China. I was just sitting here, remembering another time out on the water, and I figured, why keep it to myself? Let me tell you all about it. You see these weathered hands? They've hauled in a lot of fish in my 68 years, but they've also felt things, unseen things. I was a younger man then, maybe pushing 23, full of vinegar, and convinced I knew everything there was to know about the Santee, Cooper lakes. My daddy taught me everything he knew, and his daddy before him. We were river rats, born and bred, lived and breathed the water. But the Santee Cooper ain't just water, son. It's history, it's mystery, it's something else entirely. This particular night, I was down at the old pier by Utahville. It was a rickety thing even then, mostly patched together with old tires and hope, but it stretched out far enough into the Black River to reach the deep holes where the big catfish like to lurk. I was after a flathead, a true monster, one that could feed a family for a week. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to you like a wet blanket. The moon was barely a sliver, hiding behind scudding clouds. The only light came from my gas lantern, casting a sickly yellow glow on the water around the pier. The crickets were singing their monotonous song, and the bullfrogs were croaking like grumpy old men. It was a perfect night for fishing, a night you could feel in your bones was going to produce something special. I had my gear all set up, a sturdy old rod my daddy had given me, a reel that whined like a lovesick dog, and a line strong enough to haul a car out of the mud. For bait, I had a live bream, wriggling on the hook like it knew its fate. I cast it out as far as I could, the line singing a little tune in the night air. Then I waited. Now I'd spent countless nights alone on that pier or on the river. Never bothered me none. I knew the sounds of the night, the rustling of the palmetto leaves, the hooting of the owls, the splash of a fish jumping. But this night was different. There was a stillness, a silence that was heavier than the humidity. The crickets stopped chirping. The bullfrogs went quiet. Even the wind held its breath. It was like the whole world was listening, waiting for something. That's when I saw it. Out of the darkness, about 50 yards downriver, a light began to glow. It wasn't harsh like a flashlight or the beam of a car. It was soft, ethereal, like the light from a firefly, but bigger, more intense. It flickered and danced just above the water, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. I knew in my gut this wasn't no ordinary light. This was something else, something ancient. The light started to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. It moved towards me, along the surface of the water, leaving a shimmering trail in its wake. The closer it got, the colder the air became. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms. My mind raced. Was it a boat? Some kind of swamp gas? I tried to rationalize it, but deep down I knew this was no earthly thing. As the light got closer, I started to hear a sound, a low, mournful hum, like the wind whistling through a hollow tree. It grew louder and louder, vibrating in my bones, filling my head with a sense of dread. Then it was right in front of the pier. The light pulsed, illuminating the water below. And that's when I saw it. Beneath the light, rising from the depths of the Black River, was a figure. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, indistinct. It was made of water and light, shimmering and swirling, constantly changing. Its eyes were 2 points of intense burning light, and they were fixed on me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the spot like a cypress knee. I could only stare as the figure rose higher and higher out of the water. It reached a height of maybe 7 or 8 feet, towering over me. The humming intensified, and I felt a pressure in my head, a feeling of being probed, examined. It felt like the figure was looking into my soul. Then it spoke, not with a voice, not in words I could understand. It was more like a thought, a feeling, projected directly into my mind. "This is my domain," it said. "You trespass upon my waters." The words weren't spoken, but I understood them perfectly. And with them came a wave of overwhelming sadness, a sense of deep, ancient sorrow. I realized then what I was seeing. It wasn't just some random ghost or spook. It was a river spirit, a guardian of these waters. And it was not happy to see me. I managed to stammer out a reply, my voice trembling. I didn't mean any harm. I was just fishing. The figure remained silent for a moment, its luminous eyes still fixed on me. Then it spoke again. "These waters hold memories," it said. "Memories of joy and sorrow, of life and death. You must respect them." I nodded frantically, desperate to appease the spirit. "I do, sir. I do respect them. You seek to take life," it said. "But do you understand the cost?" I didn't know what to say. I'd never thought about it that way before. I'd always just seen fishing as a way to put food on the table, a way to connect with nature. But now, standing before this ancient spirit, I felt a pang of guilt. I don't know, I admitted. The figure seemed to consider this. Then it said, I will let you be. But remember this night. Remember the respect these waters deserve. And with that, the light began to fade. The figure slowly sank back into the black river, disappearing into the depths from whence it came. The humming subsided, and the cold air began to warm. The crickets started chirping again. The bullfrogs resumed their croaking. The wind whispered through the palmetto leaves. The world returned to normal, but I was not the same. I stood there on the pier for a long time, shaking like a leaf. I reeled in my line, cut the bream loose, and packed up my gear. I didn't want to catch any fish that night. I didn't want to take anything from the river. As I walked back to my truck, I glanced back at the water. The moon was still hidden behind the clouds, but I could almost feel the presence of the river spirit, watching me, reminding me of the lesson I had learned. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Who would believe me? They'd just think I was crazy, spending too much time alone in the woods. But I couldn't forget it. The memory of the river spirit, the feeling of its presence, the weight of its words, it stayed with me. The next day I went back to the pier, but this time I didn't bring my fishing gear. I just sat there on the edge of the water, listening to the sounds of the river. I tried to understand what the spirit had meant about the memories and the respect. Over the next few weeks, I spent more time observing the river than fishing in it. I watched the birds, the otters, the turtles. I studied the way the water flowed, the way the sunlight danced on its surface. I learned about the history of the area, the stories of the Native Americans who had lived here for centuries, the battles that had been fought along its banks. I began to see the river not just as a place to catch fish, but as a living, breathing entity, a repository of history and memory. And I realized that the spirit was right. These waters deserved respect. Now I still fish. It's in my blood, I can't help it. But I fish differently now. I'm more mindful of the impact I have on the environment. I release more fish than I keep. I try to leave the river cleaner than I found it. And sometimes, when I'm out on the water at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A light flickering on the surface, a ripple that doesn't seem quite natural. And I'll remember that night on the pier, and I'll say a silent prayer of thanks to the river spirit for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. That night changed me, son. It taught me that there's more to this world than what we can see and touch. It taught me to respect the power of nature, the wisdom of the old ways, and the importance of listening to the voices of the past. So, the next time you're out on the water, remember old Jerry's story. Respect the river. Listen to the silence. And maybe, just maybe, you'll hear the whisper of the river spirit too. You might just learn something you never expected. And always remember, son, those are the best kinds of stories. The kind that make you believe. The kind that make you think. The kind that stay with you long after the embers have died down and the fire's gone out. Now, get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll go fishing. But remember what I told you. Respect the river. I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. Now I was probably, maybe 55, 56 years old at the time. Still had a good bit of salt left in my beard, but the years were starting to show. But my boat, the Sea Serpent, she was still chugging along, faithful as ever. I'd had her for over 30 years, and she knew the waters of the Gulf of Mexico better than I knew the back of my hand. It was a scorcher of a July morning, the kind that makes the air shimmer like a mirage. The sun was already beaten down hard by 6, and the humidity was thick enough you could chew on it. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow as I pulled out of the harbor in Biloxi, the Sea Serpent groaning a little as she got underway. I was after red snapper that day, a good mess of them to sell down at the market. I'd been having decent luck, but I was hoping for a real haul. Bait was fresh, tackle was ready, and I had a cooler full of ice. I was set. I headed out to my usual spot, about 20 miles offshore, where the reef dropped off sharp. The GPS coordinates were burned into my memory after all these years. I eased the anchor down, hooked up my line with some cut mullet, and waited, regular as clockwork. The snapper started biting. I was pulling him in pretty steady for a couple of hours. Nothing huge, mind you, mostly 2-3 pounders, but enough to make it worth my while. The sun climbed higher, the air got stickier, and the snapper started to slow down. I figured they'd gone deeper to escape the heat. That's when I decided to change things up. I figured I'd troll around a bit, maybe see if I could snag a king mackerel or two. They like to cruise around those reef edges, chasing bait fish. So I pulled up the anchor, cranked up the engine, and started to motor slowly along the edge of the reef, dragging a couple of lures behind me. Now I'd caught my share of mackerel and even a few wahoo over the years, but I'd always dreamed of catching a marlin. They were the kings of the Gulf, majestic creatures that could fight like hell. I'd seen pictures, heard stories, but never had one on the line. Honestly, I figured I never would. I was just about to give up on the trolling idea and head back to my original spot when it happened. The reel on my heavy-duty rod, the one I usually used for sharks, started screaming like a banshee. That wasn't no mackerel. That was something big. I grabbed the rod, and the force nearly ripped it out of my hands. Whatever was on the other end was pulling like a freight train. The Sea Serpent started to list to one side as the line screamed off the reel. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Easy does it, Jerry. Don't get too excited." I adjusted the drag, trying to find that sweet spot between letting the fish run and putting too much pressure on the line. I knew that if I clamped down too hard, it would snap. But if I let it run too much, it would spool me. The fight was on. For the first few minutes, all I could do was hold on. This thing was just taking line, heading out to open water like it owned the place. I could feel the power in every jerk and pull. It was an exhilarating, terrifying feeling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fish started to slow down a little. I started to gradually reel in some line, gaining a few feet with each turn of the handle. It was slow, agonizing work. My arms burned, my back ached, and sweat poured down my face. I finally managed to get a little bit of the line back, and then the fish jumped. It breached the surface of the water in a spectacular display of power, silver and black scales glinting in the sunlight. I could see its long, spear-like bill and its massive size. It was a marlin, and not just any marlin. This was a monster. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I whispered. "That's a damn blue one." Now, I knew I was in for a fight. A marlin like that wasn't going to give up easy. I settled in for the long haul, knowing that this could take hours. As I fought the marlin, I started to think about everything I knew about them. I knew they were apex predators, built for speed and power. I knew they were solitary creatures, roaming the oceans in search of food. I knew they were a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the sea. I also knew that they were in trouble. Overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction were threatening their survival. It made me think about what I was doing too. Here I am, this old man trying to catch one of these things. I started to question myself. Should I really be doing this? Was it worth the risk? To the fish? To myself? Just for the thrill of the fight? But then the marlin would surge again, pulling me back to the present moment, back to the battle. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on what I was doing. Hour after hour, the fight went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat grew more intense, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. But I refused to give up. I was determined to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. Sometimes the marlin would run, taking out hundreds of yards of line. Other times it would sound, diving deep into the depths. And then it would jump again, a breathtaking display of raw power. Each time it jumped, it tested my resolve, pushing me to my limits. I drank water, ate a bit of a sandwich, and kept fighting. I knew I had to stay hydrated and keep my energy up if I wanted to have any chance of winning this battle. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange connection to the marlin. I respected its strength, its tenacity, its will to survive. I also felt a sense of guilt. I was trying to kill something that was so magnificent, so powerful, so vital to the ocean ecosystem. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to get sentimental. I was in the middle of a fight, and I had to focus on winning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the marlin started to tire. His runs became shorter, his jumps less frequent. I could feel that I was gaining the upper hand. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reel it in, inch by inch. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I kept going. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. As the marlin got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was even bigger than I had imagined. It was a magnificent creature with shimmering silver scales, a long pointed bill, and powerful, graceful fins. When I finally got it close enough to the boat, I reached for my gaff. But then I hesitated. I looked into the marlin's eye, and I saw something there, a kind of ancient wisdom, a quiet understanding of the natural world. In that moment, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't kill this fish. It wasn't about the trophy, or the bragging rights, or the money. It was about respect, about honoring the life of this incredible creature. So I did something that surprised even myself. I lowered the gaff, reached for my knife, and cut the line. The marlin paused for a moment, as if surprised by my actions. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the depths. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where the marlin had disappeared. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhilaration. I had lost the fight, but I had won something more important. I had honored my own conscience. I reeled in the line, stowed my gear, and started the engine. As I headed back to shore, I couldn't stop smiling. I had a story to tell, a story about the one that got away, a story about respect and the wildness of the sea. Now, the story doesn't quite finish there. When I got back to Biloxi, word about my encounter with the marlin had already spread like wildfire. Fishermen, dock workers, and even some tourists gathered around the sea serpent to hear my tale. They were all amazed by the size of the fish, and they were even more amazed by what I did, or rather what I didn't do. "You cut the line?" one of the fishermen asked, incredulous. "After all that fighting? You must be crazy, Jerry." I just shrugged. "Maybe I am," I said, "but I couldn't do it. It just didn't feel right." Some of them shook their heads, but others nodded in understanding. They knew what it was like to feel a connection to the sea, to respect the creatures that lived there. That night, I went down to the local bar, the Salty Dog, where all the fishermen hung out. As soon as I walked in, everyone started to cheer. "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" they chanted. The owner of the bar, Maggie, a tough old woman who knew her way around a fishing boat, came over and gave me a hug. "You're a legend, Jerry," she said. "You showed them all what it means to be a true fisherman." She bought me a beer, and I sat down at the bar, surrounded by my friends and colleagues. We talked about the marlin, about the fight, about the decision I made. As I sat there listening to their stories and their laughter, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had stayed true to myself, and I had earned the respect of my community. But the real reward came a few weeks later. I was out fishing again, trolling along the same reef where I had encountered the marlin. I was hoping to catch a few king mackerel, but I wasn't expecting much. Suddenly I saw something in the distance, a flash of silver, a swirl of water. It was a marlin, and it was heading straight towards my boat. As it got closer, I could see that it was the same marlin I had fought weeks before. I recognized the distinctive markings on its side, the scars from previous battles. The marlin swam right up to the sea serpent and circled the boat a few times. It looked at me with its big, wise eyes, as if to say thank you. Then with a graceful flick of its tail, it swam away, disappearing into the depths once again. I sat there for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. I knew that I had been blessed, that I had been given a gift. From that day on, I never looked at fishing the same way again. I still loved the challenge, the excitement, the thrill of the catch. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the beauty and the fragility of the ocean ecosystem. I started practicing catch and release more, and I took greater care to minimize my impact on the environment. And every time I went out to that reef, I always looked for that marlin. I never saw it again, but I knew that it was out there, swimming free, a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the sea. All right, now, enough waiting around. Let's drop our lines and see where this next story takes us. It must have been, late 80s, maybe early 90s. Yeah, early 90s, I reckon. I was younger then, of course, stronger, quicker. Still had all my hair then, too, though it was probably already starting to think about turning gray. Debbie and I, we were just getting settled into this place, and I was fishing like a man possessed. Didn't have the responsibility of running the cabin back then. Just me, the boat, and the open water. Pure freedom, that was. Now, you got to understand, back then, the fishing was different. Not better, not worse, just different. Regulations weren't as tight, and the fish, well, they seemed a little bigger, a little bolder maybe. Or maybe it was just me being younger and thinking everything was bigger back then. Could be that too. Anyway, I had this boat back then, a 23-foot Grady White. She was a beauty, that boat. The salty dog, I called her. Solid as a rock. Could handle anything the Gulf threw at her. I spent more time on that boat than I did on dry land some weeks, I swear. Used to head out before sunrise, come back long after dark, sometimes even stay out overnight if the fishing was good. Debbie, she'd worry herself sick sometimes, but she knew it was in my blood. Fishing, that is. It's more than just a hobby for me. It's part of who I am, like breathing air or feeling the sun on your face. So, this particular trip, I was heading out for grouper. Now, grouper, they're a bottom fish. Big, strong, delicious eating, and a real challenge to catch. They live down deep, around reefs and wrecks, anywhere they can find cover. They're ambush predators, you see. Lurk in the shadows, wait for a tasty snack to swim by, and then bam, they're on it. And once they're hooked, they'll head straight back down into their hole, try to break you off on the rocks or the wreck. You gotta be quick, gotta be strong, and gotta be smart to catch a big grouper. I had a spot I'd been fishing for years, about 30 miles offshore, an old sunken shrimp boat, down in maybe 80 feet of water. I'd caught some good fish there before, but nothing prepared me for what was waiting for me that day. The morning dawned crisp and clear, just the way I like it. Sunrise painting the sky in oranges and pinks. The air still cool and salty. The Gulf was almost flat calm, just a gentle swell rolling in. Perfect grouper weather, as we say. I had my gear all loaded up, my favorite heavy tackle rod and reel, spooled with strong braided line, and a cooler full of ice and bait. Mullet was the bait of choice that day. Nice and oily. Grouper can't resist it. I got out to the spot just as the sun was climbing above the horizon. Used my GPS, fancy stuff for back then, but it was a lifesaver, to pinpoint the wreck. Dropped anchor up current, letting the boat drift back over the spot. I like to fish with live bait when I can, but mullet chunks work just fine too, especially for grouper. I rigged up a heavy jig head, hooked a nice chunk of mullet on it, and dropped it down. Now, grouper fishing. It's not like trolling for mackerel or casting for redfish. It's mostly waiting. You drop your bait down, let it sink to the bottom, and then you just wait. Feel for the bite. Sometimes it's a subtle tap, tap, tap. Other times it's like a freight train hitting your line. You never really know. I let my bait sink down, felt it thud against the bottom. Reeled up a couple of cranks to keep it just off the seabed, and then I waited. The gentle rocking of the boat, the sound of the waves lapping against the hull, the cries of the gulls overhead. It's a peaceful sort of waiting. Let you clear your head, think about things, or not think about anything at all. Just be present in the moment. After maybe 10 minutes, I felt a little twitch on my line, just a tiny little tug, like a nibble. Could have been a small snapper, could have been a trigger fish, could have been anything. I ignored it. Sometimes those little fish just mess with your bait. You got to wait for the real deal. Then a few minutes later, another twitch, this time a bit more insistent, like something was sniffing around, getting interested. My heart started to beat a little faster. Grouper? Maybe, just maybe. I held my breath, my hand gripping the rod tight, feeling every vibration of the line. And then it happened. Wham! It was like the bottom of the ocean just exploded. The rod bent over double. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. This wasn't no little snapper. This was something big. Real big. Whoa! I yelled out loud, more to myself than anything else. Hang on tight, Jerry. The fish was pulling drag like crazy, heading straight down towards the wreck. I knew what it was trying to do. It was trying to get back into its hole, to rub the line against the sharp edges of the wreckage and break me off. If it made it down there, it would be game over. I tightened the drag on my reel as much as I dared. Didn't want to break the line, but I couldn't let it get down to the wreck either. It was a delicate balance. The rod was bowed almost to the breaking point. My arms were straining, my knuckles white as bone. This fish was strong, unbelievably strong. Stronger than any grouper I'd ever tangled with before, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. It was a straight up and down battle. Me against the fish, brute strength against brute strength. I was slowly, agonizingly gaining line. Inch by inch, foot by foot, I was pulling it up from the depths. But every foot I gained, it felt like it fought me back with two. My arms were burning, my back was aching, sweat was pouring down my face, even in the cool morning air. But I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not with a fish like this on the line. This was the kind of fish you dream about. The kind of fish that makes all those hours of waiting, all those empty trips, all worthwhile. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the screaming of the reel started to slow. The line angle started to change, pointing more towards the surface. I was gaining ground. I could feel the fish tiring just a little. Or maybe it was me who was tiring. I couldn't tell anymore. I kept pumping and reeling, slowly but surely bringing the fish up. My muscles were screaming. My hands were cramping, but adrenaline was coursing through my veins, keeping me going. I had to see this fish. I had to know what was on the end of that line. And then it started, a faint shimmer, deep down in the green water, a flash of white, and then slowly, majestically it began to rise. Bigger and bigger it grew as it came up from the depths. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was no ordinary grouper. This was a monster. It broke the surface with a swirl of white water, and I finally got my first real look at it. It was a gag grouper, and it was enormous, bigger than any grouper I had ever seen or even heard of. Its body was thick as a barrel, its mouth like a bucket, its eyes cold and ancient. It looked like something out of a prehistoric age. I just stared at it, awestruck. For a moment, I almost forgot I was still hooked up to it. It was just magnificent, truly magnificent. But the fight wasn't over yet. The fish was still plenty strong, and it was still angry. It thrashed at the surface, sending spray flying, trying to shake the hook. I knew I had to get it alongside the boat, and fast, before it found a second wind, or before the hook pulled loose. Slowly, carefully, I worked it towards the boat. It was like trying to maneuver a small truck. Every move was deliberate. Every inch gained was hard fought. Finally, After what seemed like another eternity, I had it alongside. And that's when I realized I didn't have a net big enough. I didn't have a gaff big enough. Heck, I probably didn't have anything on board that was big enough to handle this fish. I was in trouble. I circled the fish, trying to figure out what to do. It was just lying there on the surface, its massive gills pumping, its dark eyes staring at me. It was exhausted, just like I was, but I knew it could still summon up a last burst of energy if it needed to. Then I had an idea, a crazy idea maybe, but it was the only one I had. I grabbed my heavy leader material, the stuff I used to make my bottom rigs, and tied a loop in the end, a big, strong loop. Then carefully, slowly, I leaned over the side of the boat, my heart pounding in my throat. I had to get that loop around the fish's tail. That was the only way I was going to get it into the boat. But getting close enough to that monstrous mouth, well, it made my skin crawl just thinking about it. Taking a deep breath, I reached out with the loop. The fish didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was like it knew what I was trying to do. Slowly, carefully, inch by inch, I maneuvered the loop toward its tail. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the line. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the loop around its tail. Gently, I tightened it, snug, but not too tight. I didn't want to hurt the fish, and I didn't want to spook it. Then, with a grunt and every ounce of strength I had left, I started to haul. It was like trying to lift a bag of cement out of the water. My muscles screamed. My back protested. My arms felt like they were going to rip out of their sockets. But I kept pulling. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to lift the fish's tail out of the water, then its body, then its massive head. It was a struggle, a desperate back-breaking struggle, but I was winning. Finally, with a last Herculean heave, I managed to swing the fish up and over the gunwale of the boat. It landed on the deck with a thud that shook the whole boat. And then it was done. It was in the boat. I had done it. I collapsed back against the console, gasping for breath, my body trembling, my hands shaking. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the fish, at this magnificent creature I had just wrestled from the depths. It was even bigger on deck than it had looked in the water. Truly a monster. After a few minutes, when my breathing started to return to normal, I got up and went over to the fish. It was still alive, its gills still pumping, but it was exhausted just like I was. I knelt down beside it and just looked at it, really looked at it, at its thick, powerful body, its ancient eyes, its massive mouth. It was a creature of the deep, a king of its domain, and I had, for a brief moment, matched wits with it and come out on top. A strange feeling washed over me. Pride, of course, but also respect and a little bit of sadness. Sadness that such a magnificent creature was now out of its element, out of its world. Sadness that its life, which had probably spanned decades, maybe even centuries, was now going to end. I knew I couldn't release it. Not after such a long fight. It was too exhausted, too stressed. It wouldn't survive. And besides, back then, regulations weren't what they are now. Catching a fish like this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was a trophy, a story to tell for years to come. So with a heavy heart, but with a sense of awe and respect, I dispatched the grouper. It was quick and as humane as I could make it. Then I set about the task of getting it into the fish box. Even that was a struggle. It barely fit. I had to really cram it in there, and even then the tail was sticking out. The trip back to shore was, well, it was different. The boat felt heavier, more solid somehow, like it was carrying something truly significant. The sun was higher now. The day was getting hotter, but I hardly noticed. My mind was still back there, in the depths, battling that fish. When I got back to the dock, there were a few other fishermen around, cleaning their catches. As I pulled up, they all stopped what they were doing and stared. They saw the size of the fish in my boat, and their jaws just dropped. "Holy moly, Jerry, what in the world did you catch?" One of them asked, his eyes wide. "Grouper," I said, my voice still a little hoarse from yelling. "A big one." They came over to take a look, and a small crowd started to gather. Everyone was amazed. They'd never seen a grouper that big, never even heard of one that big. Word spread around the docks like wildfire. People came from all over, just to see it. We weighed it on the dock scales. It tipped the scales at, well, let's just say it was well over 100 pounds. Closer to 150 if I'm being honest. A true monster grouper. That fish, well, it fed us for weeks, and we shared it with all our friends and neighbors. It was the talk of the town for months. People still ask me about it sometimes, even now. "Jerry, remember that giant grouper you caught back in the day?" They always ask. And I always smile and say, "Yeah, I remember." How could I forget? Because you don't forget a fish like that. It's not just about the size, although that was impressive, sure. It's about the fight, the struggle, the connection you make with nature, with the raw power of the ocean,